The role of Renaissance Hermetism is often overlooked in popular accounts of the West's march to modernity. While often portrayed as the point where rationality began to supplant superstition, the Renaissance is better described as a triumph of classical over medieval thought, and the figure best associated with this period is not the free-thinking scientist of secularist lore, but the Renaissance magus. It may come as a surprise to those who divide past influences into bad mystics and good rationalists, but Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary sage of Egypt, influenced every field of intellectual and artistic expression of the period, including the fledgling natural sciences. For example, far from being a rationalist, Johannes Kepler was an astrologer who rooted his laws of planetary motion in mystical principles. Even as late as the 17th century, Isaac Newton searched for the philosopher's stone through alchemy, and his calculations of biblical prophecy through the dimensions of Solomon's temple could be linked to earlier esoteric ideas. While they may have been transformed into rationalist heroes in later centuries, their own outlook on the world quickly evaporates such claims. While never fully embraced by the Church, Hermetism did not face sustained opposition either. Its admirers sidestepped such concerns by isolating philosophical principles they saw fulfilled in Christianity from elements more commonly linked to paganism. Of course, this separation was possible only because Hermetism mixed elements of Hellenistic philosophy then fashionable with esoteric religious elements present in late antiquity. It was all a textbook case of synchronicity. Others, however, saw no reason to remove the magical elements of Hermetism and welcomed the glories of a golden age lost after centuries of darkness. They claimed there were no real contradictions between Hermetic and Christian truth, and that the teachings of Hermes, as with those of Plato and Aristotle, could be harmonized with Christianity and used for the Church's benefit. Even those far more interested in the Hermetic than the Christian would, for obvious reasons, toe this line. There was, however, one notable exception, that of Giordano Bruno, and as we shall see, his story ends with predictable results. Eventually, it was discovered that the Hermetic texts were not from a great Egyptian sage from millennia ago, but rather were composed in late antiquity. At that point, the spell was broken and the texts faded from the West's collective memory. As if Europe's intelligentsia had endured a scandal so offensive it were unspeakable, the great Hermetic revival ground to a halt and was never mentioned again in polite company. Shunned and forgotten, the only subsequent references to Hermes Trismegistus were among the dwindling number of occultists who still had faith in the once heralded sage of Egypt. Despite this fall from favor, the seeds of the Hermetic revival would flower into an explosion of interest in the mysteries of Egypt. When Hermetism was long forgotten, the mystique of Egypt's secret wisdom flourished and continues to this day. It is irrelevant that Hermetism had nothing to do with ancient pharaohs. The allure of Egypt's secret wisdom outlived the system that produced it, and would be shown in later speculation on the secret truth behind all religion. The Renaissance and the Reformation had opened the doors to avenues of thought closed for much of the Middle Ages. Movements that we might think today are anti-Christian did not always seem so at the time. For example, while we might connect Hermetism to the occult, its most prominent supporters during the Renaissance considered themselves devoutly Christian. Frances Amelia Yates did much of the groundbreaking work in bringing to light Hermetism's once-forgotten influence on early modernity, but she concentrated primarily on the Corpus Hermeticum, and it was often assumed these texts were the sole cause for the Hermetic revival. Florian Ebeling corrected this by focusing attention upon the continued interest in Hermetic sources in the medieval period. He demonstrated there were two streams of Hermetism in Renaissance Europe. That above the Alps focused on the practical alchemical texts known in the Middle Ages. Hermetism below the Alps in Italy focused on the philosophical Neoplatonic Hermetism of the Corpus Hermeticum. While Ebeling was correct in noting these two distinct Hermetic streams, he sometimes overstated the barriers between them and overlooked some significant interactions between the two streams. Both of these streams, identified by Ebeling, were linked to a Renaissance figure. The Neoplatonic approach to Hermetism in the Corpus Hermeticum dominant in Italy was associated with Marsilio Ficino. The alchemical approach, dominant north of the Alps, was linked to Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus. The differences between them illustrate the conflict in approaches. Ficino championed the Hermetism of philosophers and reinterpreted its practical elements symbolically in terms of philosophical principles. Paracelsus embraced the practical side and considered the magical arts a tool to be used for good. Neither believed their ideas conflicted with Christianity. For Marsilio Ficino, the starting point was the Corpus Hermeticum. If there is one thing scholars today agree upon concerning the texts of this compilation, it is that they are the product of the first few centuries AD. Some of the beliefs may be older, and some might even have Egyptian roots, but as a whole, the Corpus Hermeticum presents the outlook of the Hellenistic era. It is certain that the texts in the Corpus Hermeticum were not a product of the glory days of ancient Egypt. While this is obvious to scholars today, no one suspected it in 1460 when Cosimo de' Medici received a Greek manuscript purportedly containing teachings of Hermes Trismegistus. Cosimo was a major patron of the arts and letters and had even financed a revival of Plato's Academy in Florence, Italy. He immediately grasped their importance and assigned the translation of these texts to the scholar he had placed at the head of his Academy project, Marsilio Ficino. Ficino was the son of a prosperous physician and had studied medicine and philosophy. He had won the patronage of Cosimo and was later ordained to the Catholic priesthood and named the dean for the cathedral in Florence. Among the texts he had translated for Cosimo were writings of Plato, Plotinus, Porphyry, and others. His translation of the Corpus Hermeticum was completed in 1463, circulated among the intelligentsia, and was finally published in 1471. Particularly influential was his foreword, providing an intellectual genealogy of wisdom, with Moses, Pythagoras, and Plato among those influenced by Hermes Trismegistus. In Ficino's eyes, Hermes was not only the father of a philosophical tradition reaching its culmination among pagan thinkers and Plato, but also a prophet of Christianity who foresaw the decline of paganism, the rise of the Christian faith, and even the Last Judgment. The line of great figures extending from Hermes, each had received their own divine revelation in basic agreement with that given to Moses, although different in outward form. Ficino's Hermetism was Christian, albeit one of an esoteric form. He saw each man's soul as connected to an all-powerful, all-knowing world soul through which higher spiritual planes could be ascended by inward reflection. While astrology and natural magic were keys to unlocking spiritual advancement, he was quick to distinguish his spiritual magic from the demonic magic of sorcerers. While not a believer in anything resembling what appears in Zeitgeist, Ficino did, by suggesting core similarities between magic, paganism, and Christianity, cast doubt upon the uniqueness of the Christian witness. While he meticulously divided good and bad magic and distinguished the theology of the greatest minds of the pagan world from the corruptions of the pagan rabble, those who followed in his wake were not always so hesitant to blur these distinctions. Ficino also popularized the reputation of Egypt as the source of secret wisdom that would long outlive Hermetism as a force. Ficino's Neoplatonic Hermetism inspired theologians, philosophers, and artists whose own work occupied the same rapprochement of classical pagan and Christian cultures preoccupying Renaissance Italy. Egyptian motifs became common in architecture and art, and syntheses of Hermetic and Catholic principles were attempted just as had occurred with Aristotle centuries earlier. With Paracelsus, it is most striking that no one is really sure if he was that much of a Hermetist. While he did cite Hermes, this was more a reflection of a general familiarity with alchemical principles associated with Hermetism than necessarily the extensive agreement with the Hermetic texts. In reality, Paracelsus placed his own work within an overtly Christian context. He wrote extensively on theology and the Bible, and sought to extend faith to the domain of nature, particularly medicine. He rejected the scholastic philosophy that reinterpreted Christianity through Aristotelian categories, as well as the Galenic ideas that then ruled medicine. Popular views of Paracelsus often anachronistically frame him by later associations of alchemy with the occult. In the century following Paracelsus, alchemy was linked to Hermetism, and so Paracelsus was a Hermetist. Today, alchemy is linked to the occult, and so Paracelsus is an occultist. Yet, Paracelsus likely would have rejected both labels. The image of Paracelsus as Hermetist likely originates with Jacques Gauri, writing under the name Leo Suavius. Gauri favorably compared Paracelsus to Ficino and placed him among the Hermetists, rejecting Ficino's boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable magical practices. Thus, while he was not likely a Hermetist in life, Paracelsus became the symbol for the stream of Hermetism linked to the practical application of alchemy and astrology. Along with Ficino, he was looked upon as founding a movement reinterpreting classical paganism through Christian categories and blurring the boundaries between them. Another influence taking shape in this period was a Christianized form of the Jewish mystical practice of Kabbalah. Rather than competing with Hermetism, it was blended into the same framework provided by the cross-pollination of Neoplatonic and Hermetic ideas. Early steps in this development were made by the brilliant and mercurial figure of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a member of Ficino's circle in Florence whose interests were encyclopedic. Pico was an eclectic thinker who added a Christianized Kabbalah to the movement's repertoire. He eventually would fall under the sway of Girolamo Savonarola, a charismatic Franciscan friar who set up a theocracy in Florence, and then Pico would take up a life of asceticism. His exact positions on astrology and other esoteric topics during this later period is often disputed, but he would produce no clarification. The young wonder who had been a leading light of the Renaissance esoteric thought died at the age of 31. Further developing this Christian Kabbalah and bringing the two streams of Hermetism together was Johannes Reuchlin, also known as Compagnon. Reuchlin distinguished himself for his mastery of Latin and Greek, and his erudition gained him access to Ficino's circle in Florence. Though through his correspondence with Ficino, he was introduced to the work of Pico and adopted Pico's belief that the truth of Christianity could be proven through Kabbalah. In particular, he was very interested in manipulations that generated the Hebrew form of Jesus from the name of Yahweh. Further work on the Christian Kabbalah was provided by the Franciscan Hebrew scholar Francesco Giorgi, who also held that Kabbalah could demonstrate the truth of Christianity. The converging of various once shunned esoteric practices within the Hermetic revival popularized the idea that these were all once elements of the great secret wisdom that held the truth behind all religion. With Hermes Trismegistus as the deliverer of this wisdom, it was most commonly associated with Egypt, and so the race was on to crack the secrets of the ancient pharaohs. An important contribution was made with the publication of a guide to hieroglyphs from late antiquity, the Hieroglyphica of Herapolo. Herapolo was a Hellenized Egyptian of the 4th century who wrote the Hieroglyphica when the knowledge of the system had faded and was augmented by wild speculations. While at times giving correct descriptions, the author ignored the phonetic nature of many symbols and supplied symbolic interpretations. For example, the vulture symbol can represent mother. Herapolo based his explanation upon the strange belief that all vultures are female and males were not needed for reproduction. In reality, it is because the phonetic pronunciation of the sign is the same as the Egyptian word for mother. Such misguided explanations only added to the perception hieroglyphs symbolically demonstrated ancient mysteries. Since the hieroglyphs as an allegorical religious language meshed well with Hermetism, it was accepted and further speculation built upon it. The errors of the Hieroglyphica became the starting point for interpreting hieroglyphs for centuries and were reflected in later work on the subject. Still further confusion came from a bronze tablet with Egyptian inscriptions called the Mensa Isiaca. It was used as a source for studying hieroglyphs until the 19th century, when it was correctly identified as Hellenistic and its hieroglyphs were shown to be ornamental additions from someone who knew nothing about hieroglyphs. The fallout of these accumulated errors was a preoccupation with supplying esoteric explanations of ancient symbols. Dictionaries of such interpretations became common, with ideas drawn partly from Hermetism, partly from Neoplatonism, partly from medieval magic, partly from the Kabbalah, and partly from the author's own imagination. No connection was left unexplored, and their elaborate explanations continue to influence occult circles today. The most notable example came from the pen of Piero Valeriano Bolzani, a scholar supported by the Medici family. Valeriano held Christianity to be one instance of a line of divine wisdom, including the secrets of Egypt revealed in the hieroglyphs. While Valeriano at least believed his mistakes, others could not be forgiven for their misplaced integrity. Ananias of Viterbo, a Dominican who served as secretary to the Borgia Pope Alexander VI, claimed to have found texts demonstrating, among other oddities, that Noah established European civilization in Viterbo. Osiris was Noah's grandson and an ancestor of the Borgia family, and Hercules was the son of Osiris. The documents were forgeries, but his work fooled many and was frequently referenced. By the way, if you wondered what Pope Alexander VI thought of a subordinate declaring him to be the descendant of an Egyptian pagan deity, it turns out that Ananias of Viterbo had Alexander VI pegged rather well. Alexander's pontificate marked the apex of official ecclesial acceptance of the Hermetic revival. The Pope even had the Borgia quarters decorated in Hermetic symbolism and astrological signs. Additional work along these lines were provided by Nicholas Cousin and Maximilius Sandeus, who both assumed the Renaissance understanding of the Egyptian script as a system of allegory pointing to a divine language revealing the nature of God. Perhaps the most influential of all the interpreters of the hieroglyphs of this period was Athanasius Kircher. The German Jesuit scholar spent decades studying Egyptian culture and language. He made important contributions, such as discovering connections between Coptic and ancient Egyptian, but also made wildly inaccurate claims, and his attempts at translations, unfortunately based upon the Mensa Isiaca, are often amusing in retrospect. Even at a time when the legend of Hermes Trismegistus was being seriously challenged, he remained a true believer. Though brilliant, he was a prisoner of the Hermetic revival. After the reign of Pope Alexander VI, the Hermetic revival faltered in Catholic Europe as the Counter-Reformation tolerated little in the way of theological innovation. The flames of the Neoplatonic stream of Hermetism were all but extinguished by the case of Giordano Bruno. While most under Catholic rules sought to avoid conflict with the church hierarchy, Bruno would openly assert Jewish and Christian practices were corruptions of the pure Hermetic wisdom. Boldly proclaiming his Gospel of Hermes, he drew the attention of the Inquisition, was condemned for heresy, and was burned at the stake. In some sense, Bruno might be called the first pagan parallel theorist. After him, the remaining Hermetists in Catholic Europe kept a decidedly low profile. On the other hand, the northern stream of Hermetism associated with Paracelsus continued to win devotees in Protestant lands. Adding to the fire of this stream was a reaction to knowledge of the Florentine stream brought northward by Reuchlin. With alchemy and astrology already a topic of study, supporters would certainly react to Ficino's downplaying of the practical side of Hermetic magic. Such reactions are seen in the work of Johann Heidenberg, better known as Johannes Trithemius. A student of Reuchlin in Greek and Hebrew, he made no pretense of merely having a philosophical interest in the esoteric, and was critical of those who disregarded ceremonial magic. Trithemius believed God delegated our lower world to lesser beings corresponding to the planets, and he developed a system to communicate with these spirits. One controversy surrounding Trithemius concerns his use of codes. He is often cited as a founder of modern cryptography, but scholars will disagree as to whether his primary interest was cryptographical or magical. While the question is legitimate, it presupposes a post-Enlightenment dichotomy between the two. In the view of the Renaissance magus, his cryptographical work had spiritual power. There was no contradiction between the magical and the rational, or even between his roles as a magical practitioner and that as an abbé of a monastery. A further influence on Northern Hermetism was Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettenheim. With Agrippa, we clearly see priority given to the medieval magical influences rather than the classical philosophical approach of the Florentine school. Influenced by the work of Albertus Magnus, Trithemius was a mentor, and the latter encouraged Agrippa to redeem magic by removing its more superstitious elements. Agrippa was a controversial figure whose popular reputation is bordered on the demonic. This enduring reputation was reflected in literature, with Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus having the main character state, "He will be as cunning as Agrippa, whose shadows had all Europe honor him." Centuries later, Mary Shelley used Agrippa as inspiration for the mad scientist Victor Frankenstein. Also among this northern stream were Christoph Baudoff and Joachim Tanke. The former saw Hermes as a great alchemist and Paracelsus as the heir of that tradition, while the later gave alchemy a biblical role, with passages interpreted to indicate Moses knew alchemy from his Egyptian schooling. Far better known today is the darling of doomsday documentaries and supermarket tabloids, Michel de Nostradame, better known as Nostradamus, taught that Egypt was the source of secret wisdom and composed a work on the hieroglyphica of Heropolo. Finally, lest we think Hermetism was strictly a continental phenomenon, the English mathematician and astrologer John Dee was immersed in Hermetic thinking and fully embraced the vision of the Renaissance magus. Yet, as quickly as it arose, the Hermetic rival came crashing to a halt. Although there were earlier criticisms of the Hermetic texts, it was Isaac Casaubon who finally broke the spell. Hermetism's hold on Renaissance thinking was dashed when Casaubon, one of the greatest classical scholars of his day, published a critique of Hermetism in a work on church history defending the Protestant position. Because it appeared in a book dealing with another topic, it took time for his systematic dismantling of Hermetism to be fully absorbed. Once the full implications of his analysis were understood, however, the whole thing collapsed like a house of cards. Casaubon's critique concerned the Corpus Hermeticum, which a Catholic author had used to argue that Catholic precepts were common to all cultures from the earliest days and thus part of nature itself. Through careful linguistic analysis, Casaubon detected the clear style and usage of late antiquity in the Corpus Hermeticum and demonstrated the texts were likely written after the New Testament, and thus any proposed roots in ancient Egypt were simply untenable. In his comments, which were meant only as an aside in the larger argument of an ecclesial debate, Casaubon had placed a ticking bomb under the very foundations of the Hermetic revival. Once Casaubon's critique was widely circulated, few attempted to answer the challenge. While supporting the Hermetic legend to the end, Athanasius Kircher seemed oblivious to its crumbling credibility and never responded to Casaubon. Among those who did, the most eloquent was Ralph Cudworth. The leader of the Cambridge Platonists sought to deflect Casaubon's challenge by asserting it applied only to certain treatises and not the Corpus Hermeticum as a whole. He contended that knowledge of the one true God is possessed by all men, the Christian religion is characteristic of all high cultures, a monotheistic core reserved for the elites existed under the polytheistic surface of Egyptian religion, and Moses brought this true monotheism he learned from the Egyptian elite to the Israelites en masse. While conceding there were later recensions to the texts, Cudworth insisted the core was from the earliest days of Egypt, and the Greeks had adopted and passed on Egyptian wisdom. It was all for naught, however, as it became increasingly obvious the Corpus Hermeticum was from late antiquity, and Cudworth's passion and erudition did not change this most unwelcome fact for the followers of Hermes Trismegistus. Some in the northern stream of Hermetism, symbolized by Paracelsus, found consolation that Casaubon's critique applied to the Corpus Hermeticum and not their texts. Critics, however, saw little to differentiate between them, as they increasingly saw Hermes as a mythical rather than an historical figure. Northern alchemical Hermetism eventually faced its own Isaac Casaubon in the person of Hermann Conring, a professor of medicine whose target was the alternative medicine linked to Paracelsus that Conring considered quackery. In fairness to Hermetists, it must be pointed out that medicine of the period, both standard and alchemical, would be considered quackery today, but that knowledge would be centuries away. Conring asserted that all Hermetic texts were fakes, that Hermes never existed, and Egyptian knowledge was superstition that paled in comparison to that of the Greeks. He also noted that the medicine of these so-called Hermetists was not only quackery, but was unconnected to the Hermetic medicine of antiquity and was irreconcilable with Christianity. Whether his criticisms were fair or not, Conring's criticisms of both Hermetism and Paracelsian medicine hit their mark. There were rebukes by defenders of the Paracelsian tradition, but scholarly opinion had already rejected their claims. What remained of this tradition would eventually be extinguished by advances in modern science. With the demise of Hermetism, others turned to defending the idea of ancient mysteries from Egypt, even while the Hermetic texts were a later creation that mixed these mysteries with newer sources. An example of such salvage efforts occurred in the work of Paul Ernst Jablonski. While acknowledging the Hermetic texts were not genuine, he upheld Egypt as the primary source of secret wisdom. Among Egyptian accomplishments, Jablonski claimed were their roles as teachers of the Brahmins and discoverers of heliocentrism. He explained the lack of evidence for any of his claims by stating the wisdom they possessed was secret wisdom, and the lack of evidence was proof the Egyptians were great sages. This is a forerunner of Zeitgeist supporters like Acharya S., who played the Jablonski card by excusing their lack of evidence as irrelevant because all of it was secret wisdom. One is only left to wonder how they discovered the contents of such lost wisdom. Yet even Jablonski saw the end of the line for Hermetism, and his acceptance of Casaubon's case was quite telling for the future of the Hermetic revival. The historian Anthony Grafton succinctly summarized Jablonski's admission in the quip, "If so credulous a man as Jablonski saw that, then Hermes was dead indeed."